Islamic extremism. What's to be done? What is the cause? And where does the responsibility lie? On the show today, we hear two perspectives, one from an experienced journalist and media development professional who's lived and worked in London, Paris, and Moscow, but also Tashkent, Almaty, Peshawar, and Kabul. Then we hear from the co-founder of the Wiltshire Islamic Cultural Center and Wiltshire's first and only prevent officer. McWilliam and Wali Rahman join us and give very different, yet in some ways surprisingly similar perspectives on radicalization, community, and the media. From London, I'm Charles Kriel, and this is CI, Countering Violent Extremism. McWilliam is a journalist and specialist in media development and communications. He has wide experience in the post-Soviet region, Central and South Asia, and the Middle East, and a particular interest in Islamic societies. He's managed media projects in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Libya, Iraq, Tunisia, and elsewhere. He joined us in London.
My name is McWilliam. I'm currently working for an EU-funded project based in Brussels, which is advising EU delegations on how to engage better with media and to use it for development. I'm also a former journalist. I've worked for 20 years as a journalist, and I've also worked in media development, so helping local journalists in many Muslim countries to work more professionally as journalists. Well, Islamic extremism in particular, I see it as being a development that's happening as a result of changes in the Muslim world in general. I think the origins of it lie in demographic change, an expanding population, a lot of young men who are frustrated, can't find work, can't get married, and are looking for some sort of solutions to their individual problems. And that is happening at a time when across the Muslim world there's a shift towards a more conservative outlook. And that's partly because the Muslim world has become much richer, particularly with money from the Gulf. And there's a general, I would tend to feel, a shrinking of European influence, Western influence, and Islamic influence is becoming more important. And at the same time, all of those influences are being linked up by globalization, the internet, the globalization of information, and social media. And so there's this huge movement. Any social trends are now affecting the whole Muslim world. And I think the radicalism and the extremism is the extreme edge of this unsettling period for the Muslim world, this period of social change, essentially. And it's a reflection of the change in culture, the shifts in Islamic thinking. And it's the extreme edge of this conservative movement. That's how I tend to see it. And it's unsettling all the Muslim countries I can think of, places where I've worked, causing a lot of violence, a lot of death, political extremism, political radicalism. And that's why I see it as being something the Muslim world needs to address, because it's very unsettling for the Muslim world. And what we're getting in Europe, I think, is the edge of it, if you like, because it's affecting Muslim communities, Muslim minority groups in Europe as well. I've been working a lot in Muslim countries, and that's why it's a particular interest of mine in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan and many of the Middle Eastern countries. There's a lot of political problems in most Middle Eastern countries, the Arab world, but the radicalization just makes it worse. It makes it more difficult to solve the problems. I think extremism or radicalism in the West is also happening. I know less about it. I haven't been working so much in those areas. I suspect part of that is, again, polarization that's happening, partly as a result of the internet, the changes, because people's opinions seem to be becoming more polarized in the West. We see this in the UK, certainly. You see it in the US, obviously. There's a reaction against political correctness, but the opinions are being driven to extremes. And I don't think we know why, but I'm beginning to suspect that it may be to do with this reliance on social media, its echo chambers, the fact that people now get so much of their information from personalized information streams. And we're much more dominated by information. People have a constant inflow of news Certainly anyone who's looking at a smartphone is getting a constant inflow of news of various sorts. It hasn't been filtered for balance and objectivity or anything. It's simply this constant stream of information from uncertain sources. And it seems like that is increasing polarization. And I think when you have polarization, then you get the extreme right and the extreme left. Well, it's not left so much, but you get the politically correct version becoming quite extreme, and you also get the reaction, the extreme right becoming more obvious. Yeah, I think information is becoming more democratic, if you like, and that has some advantages and some disadvantages. But it used to be the case that people's information, well, we got information from the world around us, from our friends and so on, fine, that's still the case. But for things that are beyond us, information about politics, about the rest of the world, we used to get it, much less of it, and we got it filtered by specialists of one sort or another, the editors and the newspapers that controlled the flow of information. And there's obviously bad editors and there's bad media, but the information we did get had been filtered to an extent by specialists and tailored to its audience. What we're getting now is a much larger flow of information from many different sources, whether it's citizen journalists or whether it's cut and paste journalists, and none of it is controlled. Or at least initially it was completely uncontrolled, now increasingly it's controlled by algorithms. So there are computers sitting somewhere in California or wherever they are that's designing information that's provided, particularly for you, the individual, your phone. And that, I think, is the dangerous aspect, because what that does mean is this massive flow of information we're getting is particularly tailored to our own personal likes and dislikes. And I think that tends to drive people to extremes. When you're only getting information from people who agree with you or people who are slightly more radical than you, and particularly because the supply of information we're getting is, uses all this massive information that's being collected about us, our likes and our dislikes, and it's specifically using that to feed us with a supply of information that will emotionally involve us, which makes it even more dangerous, because it is information which is designed to attract us emotionally. And so when your supply of information about politics or the world, about society, is all personalized and emotionalized, I think that's quite dangerous, and it seems to me that's what's happening. I think we've got to start being much more sophisticated about our use of social media and about the internet. People have to be much more aware of the sources of the information. It's a bit like television advertising. In the old days, when people watched television, people used to be concerned about the messages that young people were getting in advertising, and so legislation or controls are brought in to control what young people are exposed to. That doesn't happen on the internet. You're exposed to the full panoply, from ISIS radicalization to porn to whatever, and because the internet is global, it's much more difficult to control. So I think we're going to have to get to the point where there's a lot more self-control, and people, young people obviously, but everyone who's on a smartphone or the internet, you have to be aware of what information you're getting from the world and where it's coming from, and you're probably going to have to exercise some self-restraint, some control over what you're getting. I mean, just personally, I've seen this myself. You can waste an awful lot of time on Facebook. So maybe some of us have to decide not to bother with Facebook because we've got better things to do. And I think Facebook in particular I'm slightly worried about, because everywhere I go, I see that journalists use Facebook as their default setting across much of Asia, the entire Arab world. You go to a shisha cafe anywhere in the Arab world, and what you see is young men sitting, staring at their phones, looking at Facebook. And Facebook is selecting the news they get, what they hear about Syria, what they hear about the West, what they hear about social relationships is all coming from this personalized news feed they get on Facebook, often sent to them by their friends. So it's this community of like-minded people who are sharing information among themselves in these echo chambers. And Facebook, of course, is recording all this information and monitoring us and watching our likes and dislikes and so on, and is using that for its own business interests. But I think people need to be aware of that and be much more selective about the information they're getting and the information they decide to consume. Traditionally, media development at the moment hasn't been focused on this. What media development to date has been working on strengthening radio, television, newspapers, less so newspapers these days. In recent years, it's much more focused on setting up websites, helping local communities to create their own websites and put their information online. We haven't quite got to the point where people are really looking at the oversupply of information and filtering the oversupply or controlling the oversupply of information. I think that's the next step. In particular, media literacy. Media literacy, I think, is something that needs to get started. It's happening to an extent. There are a small number of organizations, in the Middle East and so on, that are starting to do it, but it's not getting much funding. Donors either aren't aware of it or they say, yes, it's a good idea, but they're a bit nervous about it and don't know how to approach it. So there isn't actually much going on in this field yet, but I think this is what needs to be focused on. And as I say, with young people in particular, I think it's media literacy. There needs to be much more focus of helping people to understand their source of information and being much more critical of what they're getting online. Much of this, new projects often have to be donor funded, essentially, at least at this stage. And certainly the places I work, overseas, the Middle East, South Asia and so on, a lot of media, a lot of socially responsible media, if you like, depends on donor funding. But there are a certain number of funders that do put money into media projects, but it's quite haphazard at the moment. And I think this is what something needs to happen. There needs to be more coordination and more understanding by the development world and the donor-giving world of how important media is, how important information is, and they could be directing the money they do put towards media support more carefully. Again, it's something that's just developing. It's something I've been looking into recently, actually, is sources of funding and where it could be coming from and where it ought to be going. So it's a new area. It needs to be promoted in particular. In the long term, ideally you want sustainable projects. You don't want media depending on donor funding. Again, this is something completely new. We don't know what's happening. We know the standard traditional forms of funding media have all collapsed. They've been disrupted by the internet and by social media. Advertising no longer goes to traditional media, at least not to the extent it did. So media outlets are in a quandary trying to work out what a successful business model is for media, even in the West. Websites generally tend not to be, they don't make a profit. Most newspapers in the West or media outlets in the West have set up websites, but they're often funded by the mainstream media or by connected businesses. So this is another huge area where we've got to start looking. How do you support local media? How do you enable them to be sustainable? We need a business model. Is it through advertising? Is it by enabling them to produce information products of some kind that people are willing to pay for so that they're providing services as well as information? It's a new area and needs to be worked in, but we don't have an answer yet. I think media literacy in the long term, everything has to be very long term, media literacy and an awareness of sources of information potentially could lead to less radicalization, less extremism among young people. But it's a rising tide, the extremism. There's an awful lot of push factors. There's an awful lot of pressure, an awful lot of funding goes into promoting radical views of Islam. And there's an awful lot of political and social upheaval, political problems. Whenever you have conflict, that naturally drives people to extremes, and we have not fair number of conflicts currently in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, and that is driving people to extremes. So it won't be an easy task, but you have to get started somewhere. A lot of the radicalization is being driven or facilitated by social media and by online developments. Everything happens much faster than it would have done. 5-10 years ago, this problem didn't exist. It was very minor. Yes, you had some men grooming people at madrasas in Pakistan, but now you have ISIS doing it as it's a global operation, grooming, and it's only possible because of social media and smartphones and the internet. So the problem's there. It's probably going to get worse because there's no sign at the moment of some of these stresses and tensions in the Middle East or the Muslim world are being solved. So we've got to start. If it's a media problem, there has to be some sort of media reaction. I think the media industries or the information world needs to be involved in some way in counteracting and working out solutions. but it's only just getting started, and it's, I would say, quite urgent because if you have continued spreading of radicalization, then you're going to have more deaths. And I say this about Muslim countries. Places I've lived, Pakistan is horrendous now. I mean, 15 years ago, I lived in Pakistan, and there was bombings then. There have always been bombings then. But now I go back and I talk to people there, and they say, oh, it's terrible. We don't even want to get into buses anymore because we don't know who's going to be putting bombs there, and we don't even know who's responsible for them. And it's all part of these political tensions, partly driven by radicalization, extremism, Afghanistan, ethnic tensions, sectarian tensions, the whole thing. And it's all magnified by this extremist attitude. I suppose I can't really say I'm very positive. I'm naturally a bit of an optimist. I think things can be done. I think it needs to be addressed. It needs focused interest. It needs work from the tech companies in particular, because, of course, they are the conduit for an awful lot of this stuff, and it's not good enough just to sit back and say, we're a telephone line. Nothing to do with us, gov. So they have to be involved, governments have to be involved, donors have to be involved, citizens have to be involved, most of all. I mean, with Islamic ground extremism in particular, it's something that Muslims themselves have to sort out. It's an internal issue within Muslim societies, and I think it has to be addressed there. Outsiders can't fix it. I'm generally optimistic, but I think there are going to be big problems, and I think radicalism is going to be a problem in Europe, well, for the future. I don't see any particular end to it, no. But, we have to deal with problems and challenges as they come along, and I think, I suspect things will be sorted out. The situation might be ameliorated in a generation. But we have to take act. We have to do something about it. We have to address the issue. And I think information and media is one way to address it.
Ian McWilliam, journalist and media development specialist. This edition of CI Countering Violent Extremism is brought to you by CI, the Corsham Institute. Our work focuses on education and research. Countering Violent Extremism is one of our major programs, and we spread information on the latest news and research in the field through our podcasts. I'm your regular host, Charles Kriel. Wali Rahman was born in India and moved to the UK as a child. He lives in Trowbridge, where he co-founded the Wiltshire Islamic Cultural Centre in 2008. He's also Wiltshire's first and only Prevent officer. He joined us in London.
I'm Wali Rahman, Secretary of the Wiltshire Islamic Cultural Centre. So the Wiltshire Islamic Cultural Centre was set up in 2008 to educate people about Islam and also tackle misconceptions and also build bridges between communities and do a lot of outreach work. So we work with local schools, interfaith groups, the police. I've also been Wiltshire's first and only Prevent officer in 2009. Ever since 9/11 and the incidents of 7/7 and so on, I've been active in my local community in promoting community cohesion and countering extremism. Wiltshire is a mainly rural community, and although it's very peaceful, multicultural in certain parts, there are a lot of areas where you will see very few ethnic minorities. For example, Trowbridge, where I live, has the second largest Moroccan community outside of London in the UK, and therefore, by default, it has a large Muslim community. And although we have a very peaceful community, and generally people sort of are well integrated and there aren't any problems, we wish for it to remain that way, and we work very hard to keep that community cohesion going. So in Wiltshire itself, I've never come across any direct threat of extremism. The only threat that we've had that I'm aware of was back in 2010, and it was an outside threat, and this was from none other than Anjem Choudhury and his group Islam for UK. And what happened back then is a very good example of the work and the relationships that we had built. So in 2010, we had heard that Anjem Choudhury was planning to march at the repatriation of British soldiers in Royal Wootton Bassett. And immediately we reacted in a strategic way. We did not want to see the likes of Anjem Choudhury or his group anywhere in Wiltshire. So we immediately wrote a press release condemning the march and vowing that we would take every action to stop the march from happening. And if it did happen, then we would counter march. And what happened was we sent out a press release. Immediately it gathered momentum and attention worldwide, so it featured in every news outlet I can sort of think of on that day, from Al Jazeera to Sky News and BBC. We worked very closely with the council and the police to actually stop that march from taking place, and we received a lot of positive responses from the wider community for that. I think it's very sad and unfortunate, actually, to see the state, the state that the world is in at the moment. So, from a personal standpoint, I can see extremism on all sides. So, especially if you log on to social media, you can see the obvious extremism that is sort of prevalent at the moment, in my opinion, which is the far right extremism. Of course, you have the so-called Islamic extremism. There's extremism on all sides, and I think that makes our work harder, but also at the same time it's rewarding to see a lot of like-minded people coming together and thinking of ways and strategies to combat extremism on all sides. I think people have a lot of genuine concerns and fears, and people have felt marginalised on all sides of the coin. But the way that some people are reacting, obviously, is not the correct way to respond to those situations. So we need to think about how we can win the hearts and minds of people on all sides, and whether it's through media, through storytelling, through outreach activities, events, bringing people together. And this is something that the Wiltshire Islamic Cultural Centre, we pride ourselves on doing, which is bringing people together from different backgrounds. Also reaching out to people. So if people are fearful of the Muslim community, for example, we would be happy to reach out to them and talk to them and discuss things over a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And I think that's the best way to combat these stereotypes and these ill feelings and resentment towards the other. I think the key is building relationships and friendship. I think friendship is one of the most important things. I think in general we can see it happening, but also in my personal experience I've seen a lot more positive interaction and people coming together as a result of certain incidents or certain sort of extreme events, if you like. So, for example, when we had the Manchester and London bombings recently, we actually found that more people were attending our local mosque open day as a result of that, and coming and wanting to reach out to the Muslim community to say that, don't worry, we don't think that you're all like that. And, so I think, I think a general rule in life I find is that in the face of adversity, people do come together, and sometimes, despite tragedies which occur, you do find people coming together and working together to create a better good. I think sometimes the unfortunate tragedies that occur actually do bring people together, because people, as communities, they're far more resilient, and I think the vast majority of people in all societies, the vast majority of people, I believe, are good and, want to get on with each other. So whenever something happens that might divide people, I think sometimes it does the opposite and brings people together, those, like-minded people who wish good for society. I think the media has a huge responsibility on their shoulders, because millions of people read and see, what they produce, and if they don't get it right, then they can cause a lot of harm on communities, as we have seen many times in the past. I think also as a Muslim community we've felt hurt a lot by some of what the media has portrayed about the Muslim community, and ignoring some of the good things that Muslim communities have done, and rather focusing on the negative aspects. So I think definitely media plays a huge part, and I think throughout history media has also been a catalyst and played a pivotal role in the way societies go. I personally don't understand why people would be pushed into extremism, especially from an Islamic viewpoint. I can't see why someone with common sense or rationale would go to extremism. And if we look at the profiles of a lot of the people who have been prone to extremism, we see that they have very sort of troubled backgrounds, and also they don't have an understanding of the Islamic religion, for example. And in some cases, we've seen that there's an MI5 report that shows that the religious literacy is very poor among extremists, and in some cases they found copies of books like Islam for Dummies, on the persons of these extremists. I think the Muslim community in Wiltshire generally feels safe and not under any threat from either side of the extremism spectrum, whether it be from the far right or from Islamic extremism. And I think for the most part this is due to the work of the police, the Wiltshire Police Force, and also we have a great relationship with the local press. I think that helps a lot. And the mosque also does a lot of outreach work in Trowbridge. So as well as our organisation, the Wiltshire Islamic Cultural Centre. So I think generally we feel safe and welcome in Wiltshire, and we work very hard to keep it that way. I personally feel the best way to counter the extremist narratives is to provide the alternative, the correct Islamic narrative. And for me, speaking from a religious perspective, this has always been the most successful narrative. Research has also shown that, for example, we know that religion isn't the main driving factor that drives the extremists. And we know that they're not getting their knowledge from authentic Islamic sources. So the best way, in my view, to counter that, and I've always felt that Islam itself is against extremism, so the best way to counter extremist ideology is to present the correct and authentic understanding of Islam, and which we see a lot of Muslim scholars and academics are doing worldwide. They're doing a great job, but unfortunately we don't see a lot of it being picked up by a lot of the media outlets. But I think it's definitely something we should consider in our fight against extremism. People who are disenfranchised, who are on the edges of society, they feel like people are invading their country and taking their jobs. I think a lot of those feelings have come up recently, and I personally feel that's what's led to some people going to the extreme of the far right, for example, and other political groups who promote that us versus them idea. I feel sympathetic towards those people because of their plight, but also I think that they're not looking at what's going on rationally, and it's a lot based on emotion, and that's what a lot of these people who are promoting the idea of extremism, they pull on people's emotions, or whatever that extreme ideology may be. I think the best way to counter those who are pushing an extremist agenda is to use the means that we have at our disposal, so the media, social media, radio, internet, TV programs. I think that those are all key elements of countering that narrative, and by showing the other side of the story, showing positive stories of certain communities, whether that be Muslim communities or any other communities, showing the good things that they do, showing where they are standing up against those within their midst who are extreme. So I think we need to highlight more of that, and also we need to show stories of people coming together from different backgrounds. So whether it's showing groups working together to fight against the common extreme ideology, or people coming together just for the love of humanity. You have a lot of interfaith work going on locally and nationally, so bringing more of that to the fore. I personally feel that we've had many years of negativity and sort of despair in terms of what we see from the media, but I personally feel recently, I feel inspired and I feel really positive about what I've been seeing in the media, whether that's locally or nationally. And recently we've seen a lot of good TV programs, for example, showing the reality of what's happening, but also showing that the vast majority of Muslims are not like that group, of extremists, and also showing that and differentiating that from the religion and from the vast majority of the adherents of that religion. I think I have a positive outlook on the future in terms of what I hope to see from the media and from the politicians as well.
Wali Rahman, co-founder of the Wiltshire Islamic Cultural Centre. CI Countering Violent Extremism is a production of Corsham Institute. Music today was produced by Audiobinger and me. I'm your producer and host, Charles Kriel. Thanks for joining us.